So I don't really know of another video like this on YouTube, which is why I'm taking time out of my day to record this. We're going to be talking about openings, and in particular, we're going to be going against the typical grain of thought where when people talk about openings, there's two main ways they think about it. It's like either you play a main line, and a lot of people, like especially coaches, they tell you should play a main line because when you play a main line, you play something that's time tested, you get more rich structures, whatever the hell that means, which helps you like develop a lot of your other skills in chess compared to sidelines rather, where you'll very often gain more like dodgy short-term weapons, which may in the short term get you some quick results and increase your rating, but over the long term aren't really going to help develop you as a chess player. But today I want to take a bit of a different approach to all of that and suggest that you guys, if you want to have really good openings that work well on a practical level, I think for most players who are watching my channel, like below the title level, like under 2300, this works in particular very well. But even guys like Repertoire, they basically like their repertoire follows this approach where what you want to do is you want to take a main line and then you basically play a side line within the main line. And I'm going to show you guys with multiple examples in this video what I mean, including some of my own games in like the last year or so where I've really started using this sort of approach more. But first of all, like move one already, like if we were to say take 1e4, like of course the sideline would be something like maybe g6, modern Scandinavian d5 or something, and the main line would be something like French, e5, Caro, Sicilian, I'd say. And already let's just say like we take e5, let's say we put the Roy Lopez on the board. In this position, like okay, you could play the Berlin defense, but do I really recommend the Berlin defense? Like, I mean, no, because you're going to get kicked out of your local chess club if you play this enough times, because you're going to start reminding people of Vladimir Kramnik, and in 2024, no one wants to be reminded of Vladimir Kramnik. So that's why, like, for example, in this position, okay, you could also play a6, but that's boring. You could play g6. And let's actually take a look over on the side where my mouse is, if you guys have functioning eyes. If you look down on this list here, you can see a6 is most popular, knight f6 second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. g6 is actually the eighth most popular move, being played in about 8,000 games of 600,000, and it actually scores the best of all these moves, which is really interesting. And also, I think it's good to also take into consideration like the engine evaluation. So let's pull Stockfish up, for example. Knight f6 is like, okay, on somewhat low depth, like plus 0.2 or whatever. And g6 isn't really much, like that much worse. Like, no, it's like plus 0.5. And again, that's only really like if they play all the best moves. Like, for example, if we want to show some like very normal looking continuation, in the database, let's say we have this on the board, so maybe let's say, not what I intended, let's say a6, bishop a4, bishop g7, d4, e takes d4, still like plus 0.5, you can see there's like 500 or so games in the database. Let's say b5, let's say bishop b3, that's still the most common move, knight e7, and castles, knight c3, and already you can see like at this point, this is quite interesting. d5 is apparently the best move. This is what keeps the advantage, and it's being played in 100 or so games in the database, but by far the most common move, knight c3, which is very natural. And already after this, you can see the score in the database drop, and this is a sign of a good sort of sideline you want to play, where your opponent plays very natural moves, but these natural moves sort of lead them down a path of actually a not that amazing position. Let's say like again, we take the most common move in the database, h3. Apparently, like knight d5 is a bit better, but that's not the most natural move in the world. Let's say knight a5. They want to keep their bishop, probably. That's what most people do. And now after c5, we have a very interesting point where 470 games, and like if we just go back to see what the score was for c5, it's 40%, which means 60% score for black. And like as far as I'm aware, in most mainline Roy Lopez positions, you aren't getting 60% for black, which really highlights what we're actually doing here, which is that It's not just we're playing some sideline, it's that we're getting our opponent into a position, like a type of position which they're just not really that comfortable with, compared to, again, some like more mainline stuff, like maybe the Berlin, or maybe like this, this A6 stuff. Like, I have a friend who really likes to play like this, well, Spanish stuff it's called, with black, but to be honest, like, this is really boring. And if you look in the database, like, it actually just doesn't score, like, okay, it scores normally, I can't say it scores that badly, but to be honest, like, every white player, if they play the Roy Lopez, they know this, they enjoy this. But G6, on the other hand, good chance they've never really studied this before. You're going to be the one who has that home ground advantage, and opposed to, like, one G6, where white can sort of play a lot of different ways and get decent position, I feel like, just because with G6 playing that so early on, you're surrendering a lot of the center. Playing G6, like, say, in this position, forces white to be a lot more precise, and there's a good example of what I mean when I say we want to play sidelines within main lines. So basically, like, this video, what it's going to be, like, okay, I gave a brief introduction, I'm just going to be giving more examples. I'm going to be going through games that I played, how I use these sorts of ideas to really give you guys inspiration for, and also just a better, more clear idea of what I mean when I talk about sidelines of main lines. Okay, this game, for example, I played this last year against like an 1800 FIDE, that is, and we basically had this very sort of classical mainline Caro. Everyone on YouTube, they like to play Knight f6 these days. Even I'm guilty of having played this recently, but okay, this is like a very respectable main line, and basically, like, this is all very classical theory. If you look in the database, 3,000 games have happened from this position, so quite a lot. And what I've always played up until this point was castles, but I knew, like, my opponent was like blitzing out all these moves. I'm like, okay, he's probably done his preparation, he's probably got something in this position he's gonna play. So even though I hadn't prepared this specifically before the game, I'd looked at some other stuff throughout the years, and I knew, for example, like in this position, like Queen b6 is an interesting, like, sideline, again, of a main line, which I can play. And it's very interesting if you look at this in the database. It has been played 700 times, so it's not like it's unknown, but it scores quite well in comparison. I think it's just because, like, a lot of players, like, they haven't really specifically studied this, and already that gives you a big practical advantage, because you have a simple plan, like, you're going to bring a rook to d8, go c5, and very quickly pressure their center, which you don't get to do as quickly with castles, at least from my understanding. But this is the thing that I really want to drive home in this video. With Queen b6, are we, like, radically changing the, like, nature of the Caro Kann? Like, no, we're not. Like, it's still a very solid Caro Kann. We're just changing it very so slightly, such that our opponent isn't really going to have as, because a lot of players, right, like, this is how it goes, right? They buy some chessable course, they memorize some lines out of a book or whatever, and then they feel very confident, but they don't actually know the positions. You just change one small detail, they're fucked. And, like, already here, I remember in the game, like, my opponent started spending, like, inordinate amounts of time, like, in what is otherwise a pretty normal position. Like, he ended up playing knight e4 after a while, which isn't even critical. I think he spent like 10-15 minutes maybe. I played rook d8, and okay, I end up winning the game. To be honest, like, I played it in a bit of a dodgy manner later on, but okay, I actually have in my notes here, by this point I had 88 minutes on the clock, he had 62 minutes, and keep in mind, this guy, like, he came to the game prepared, and I'm not knocking him or anything, by the way, I don't want to give that impression, but I'm just saying, right, like, this is the power of, like, playing sidelines of main lines. Your position isn't, like, objectively, like, refuted or anything because you're playing some dodgy crap that you found on YouTube. You're actually playing something respectable. You're just changing it slightly. Again, I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but just that little bit of surprise value can really take your opponent actually out of their comfort zone a little bit. So this one is not a classical game. This is a rapid game I played in last year, actually against a friend of mine who is technically an international master. He got it through a zonal tournament though, so not quite a proper international master. Sorry, Cameron, if you're watching this, but yeah, we had a Philidor defense, and the Philidor is not necessarily a mainline opening by any means. This is a bit of an exception, but it's nonetheless still, like, reasonably solid. And basically in this position, you know, there's 9,000 or so games in the database. Black has a bunch of things they could do. B6 is like some old main line. A5 is another thing. Queen C7, H6. There's all these moves that you can play. I even had some opening course that was like play H6. But I was like, no, I want to do my own research on this. And I came up with this interesting move, E takes D4. And what led me to this move was not necessarily the database stats. Actually, I was wondering because in a lot of lines I was thinking like E takes D4 can happen at a lot of different points. I want to better understand these structures where we release attention, so let's study what happens if we take immediately. And actually I found out a lot of interesting things. To begin with, like, well, the Philidor in general isn't super well studied. A lot of people get to this position, maybe have a vague idea of some plans to do after A5, B6, but like if you've really studied some proper theory, you're actually going to have like a real proper leg up on your kind of opponents here, like I did in this game, where I'd really studied this E takes D4 stuff. I knew all the nuances. My opponent, did he know all these nuances? No, like he's probably never looked at this in his life, and well, like with the limited time you have in the world, you're going to spend your time looking at this random sideline in the Philidor. Probably not, but you know, that's the point of this video. I'm telling you to do this shit that your opponents are never going to do. So we play into the sideline, and it's also worth discussing queen takes d4, where you actually play knight e5. A very cool idea where basically everyone online, when I play some blitz, falls into the swing. What I like to do, guys, this is a pro tip. After you play e takes d4, you pre-move knight e5, so that if your opponent plays queen takes d4, you basically trick them into thinking that you blundered here because you assumed they were going to play knight takes d4, but the reality is they're actually stupid, because after they win the pawn and you play knight g4, they're kind of screwed. Like I've had people basically just lose after this. Bishop takes f2 coming next, they're screwed. If they go queen h5, then you get queen d4, you fork this and this. So queen g3 is probably the best move, but sorry, no, I misspoke. Queen f4 rather, and now bishop d6 takes, knight takes e5, you win the pawn back. And they can't really play rook takes e5 because after queen c7, we're going to be winning the exchange. If they take here in the hopes that they get to do some sneaky shit like this, they're not, because we're just going to play king h8. And now both this and this hanging at the same time, so we're going to be winning material. There's no way around that. So knight takes d4 though, this is the best move. This was played in the game. I play knight e5, gain the tempo, and the bishop comes back. And there's actually some nuances, real differences between like bishop f1 and bishop a2. I'm not going to get too into depth in this, but basically what happened was I played queen a5. I end up executing this really cool maneuver, bringing my bishop around. He tries to play b4, trap my queen, no bueno. And I end up gaining a really good position out of seemingly nowhere, where like it was actually a very clean game despite being rapid, and end up pulling off this tactic where wherever the knight moves, this is going to hang. There's no like intermediate checks or whatever. And in this position, he ended up resigning since I'm going to queen way before he does. And again, like this whole like, by the way, by this point it's quite interesting. It might not seem like it, black's already like equalized. I'm going to put in the engine here. Yeah, if you look at this, already equal. A bit surprising if you've never seen this before. And like in this position, for example, even though like e takes, and sometimes you shouldn't read too much into the evaluations. Again, it really like, sometimes engines will say something is good, but in order to play it well, you have to play like really accurately in human chess to do so. But I don't really think that's the case here. This variation, and after e takes d4, knight e5 is not even really the top engine move. It's saying like some d5 stuff, which I'm not really sure if it's good. This actually scores really badly in the database. This is an example where sometimes the engine can mislead you, like where I think you basically just get like some sort of symmetrical position here, which if my computer will properly load, I can show you. Okay, so like say e takes d5, bishop b3, sorry, knight b6, bishop b3 rather, and like in this position, like basically white just has more active pieces and symmetrical positions, so like this isn't very pleasant. But yeah, like the whole knight e5 thing, yeah, he played some slow moves, like probably you should go h3, f4 or something like that at the very least to try and be a bit more active. f3 was a bit passive, but again, it's difficult to blame him when like he's never really studied this in his life before, and I have. But again, that's why we do this. This is why we play sidelines of main lines. Okay, so this is an example where I basically take this sideline of a main line concept I've been rambling on about this whole video, and I just put it on absolute steroids. So some of you may have actually seen this already if you've been following all my game recaps. This one was from the Australian Championships this year, like basically 2 months ago, where I'm playing another guy who's like 2200, Kian Lee, and he is white of course, and he plays a Qc2 Nimzo. We previously had another game where we played this sort of very solid E3 Nimzo stuff, but this game he decides to go Qc2, the so-called classical, or is it Capablanca? I don't know, but he plays this line which, you know, people know. It's like, okay, after E3, it's the most common move in the database. So a lot of games after this, 80,370 to be precise. And he was probably preparing for something like castles, because that was what all my games in the database basically continued. And I knew that from one of my friends who played him before, that he actually played this E4 line in this position, which can get very sharp. And yeah, I couldn't really be bothered learning the theory for that. So before the tournament, I was playing around a little bit, because I'd seen like in some various lines, for example, the Queen's Gambit declined, people have been playing like h6 randomly, and this is another example of a sideline of a main line. Okay, let's look at this. This is fun. So Bishop e7, Queen's Gambit declined, most popular. Then Semi-Slav c6, second most popular. Rogozin, third most. Knight d7, non-name opening. Fourth most. c5, that's Semi-Taraj. Fifth, d takes c4, Vienna. Is that, wait, hold on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, 6, 7, a6, I forget what that's called. Knight c6, bad move, but somehow, is that, I think that's 8, b6, another bad move, that's 9th, and then h6 actually is, I think, like 10th most, but it's actually not such a bad variation. Again, if we put the engine on just to, like, prove this stuff in case you guys don't believe me, like, you know, if you look at like the cloud engines have been put in really high depth, like this stuff is just as good as like, almost as like, you know, like these other moves, like, you know, like d takes c4, bishop b4, whatever you want to say. Like h6 is not that bad despite looking really stupid. Some people have even done that, like on move 3 without even like developing the knight out. They will just go like this, and like, you know, if you look on the side of the database here, like, there are 2,600 guys doing this. It's really not that bad. It's even like a Magnus Carlsen game. Granted, Magnus Carlsen has played everything, so it doesn't necessarily mean much, but I basically took that inspiration, was playing around one day, and I've given the story before, so some of you guys might have heard it already, but I was basically trying to go into the Nimzo Indian then, and where like d5 hasn't already been played, and find, are there any variations where h6 can be played, just for the fun of it, right? And I figured out one day, like, this sort of works. There's 100 games in the database, but a lot of people who were playing it were basically idiots, and the people who were like good and had played it, they often didn't play it correctly. So in many ways, I sort of saw this, maybe incorrectly so, as a novelty of mine, where after e4 we got into this very sharp variation with c5. Maybe not completely sharp is the right word to use, but you know, if you're interested in more of the details, I'll try and leave this somewhere up in the cards if I remember. Otherwise, you can just go to my videos, and like, it will be in one of those where, yeah, basically the key idea was that after c takes d4, a3, bishop f8, this position, believe it or not, is just good for black already, where like if you move the knight back to like, I don't know, b1 for whatever reason, then I'm gonna have queen a5 check, I'm gonna fork the pawn on e5, and the king. Why my computer is not moving is a mystery to me, but yeah, for example, this would be what we are aiming for. This is quite good. There are some better moves, like you can see the engine like working here, like d takes c5 is apparently better. Like, I've analyzed all this stuff before, of course, but even in this seemingly dodgy variation, like even then, like if you run the engine high enough to depth, it's still like actually okay. And like, again, let's look at database stats, right? After queen c2, like, okay, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth most popular move, 100 games out of like 80,000. So basically, if I've done the math correctly, basically no one ever plays it. And actually, this would be an interesting case where, with a lot of the other lines we've looked at so far, where we played like this really rare like sideline of a main line, this one actually scores like dog shit pretty much. It scores like way worse than a lot of the other moves, but And that's again because the people who are playing this line either just are patzes playing h6 for no reason, because of course like h6, if you look at it, it breaks all the rules of chess openings. Like that's why like I wouldn't really recommend this unless you've properly studied it. Otherwise it's just gonna go terribly wrong. Or the players might not have been half bad, but like they didn't really, either they forgot what they were doing or they never really properly studied it in the first place. Which is again why, and I think I said this earlier, but like you can't read too much into database stats sometimes. Sometimes you really have to look at the position for yourself and figure out what the hell is going on. And look, I also want to say, like, you don't need to do this for every like line in your repertoire, but if there's like certain spots where like, you know, you get some opening course, some book, and it's telling you to play all these long theory moves, like don't be hesitant to like look earlier on and be like, the main move is castles, my book tells me to like play this, but like man, I really hate all these like super sharp like positions in these lines. I want to do something else for my life. I mean, like, I would welcome you to the H6 Nimzo Club. I would do that very happily. Whether you want to do that or not is your life decision. There's also other stuff you can do, like knight c6, for example. I've played this before. This is another example of a sideline of a main line. I think this is called the Zurich variation. I guess someone in Zurich like to play this a lot, but like again, this is just another way you can take a solid opening and mold it into like your own thing, where you're going to go for a setup that you find comfortable. It might not be the best according to the engine, but like it does decent enough in practice. You get decent results with it. Hopefully, I mean, if you're playing something over and over again, you score horribly with it, that's probably something you should look into. But I also just want to give some examples from the white perspective of some stuff that I've done in my own games. For example, this was a game I played at Club Chess last year against one of my friends. Actually, he might be watching this, where I played knight c3 move 6, and basically the reason I did this is because all my games in the database went castles, and if you look also, like, this is mainline Catalan stuff, 44 something thousand games, most of them have gone short castles, some have like gone queen c2. That's a sideline. It's definitely what I'd call a sideline of a main line. Or you could even go knight c3, even less common. And very typically in the Catalan, actually, like, even though knight c3 is a very normal developing move, by the way, my most popular video on the channel, 20 I think ideas you must know on the Catalan, go check that out if you're interested in this opening. It's a lot of people say good things about it. It's gotten like 13,000 views at the time of this video, I think. So really popping off that video. Just a small ad in the middle of the video. Shameless plug. Apologies for that. But knight c3, like, okay, after castles, very often, like, they say go for the closed Catalan, then you want to put the knight on d2. At least it's sort of like the old school for it. It's changing a little bit. But knight c3, it does lose some of that flexibility, right? Which is why it's a little bit less common. But nonetheless, like, just a small change, like, it really does throw people off, I think, sometimes, where, like, for example, my opponent played a6, which is a bit of a strange move, because after takes and like knight e5, like, I don't really see what a6 does. And to be honest, he just got a very poor position where, like, after all these exchanges, like, it might look like they're not doing too badly, they've swapped off queens and stuff, but this is, if you know anything about the Catalan, pretty bad for black. If you switch the engine on, it's plus 1 point something. It's pretty awful. Big advantage for white already, mainly because of our Catalan bishop and their very passive light squared bishop, and just their difficulties sort of getting pieces out. But really the big idea of knight c3 also, I should say, is like after d takes c4, like compared to castles d takes e4, which is like a big main line of the Catalan, very, very well studied. Knight c3, like, if they want to play in the same spirit with d takes c4, basically the idea is that now knight e5, compared to castles takes knight e5, where now they play this very precise move, knight c6, this is the best one. And there's all these like theoretical lines can happen after this. For example, one notable one is, let's say, queen a4, e5. If they go c5, it's important to note that queen a3, I think, is sort of unpleasant when you put this very annoying pin on them. e5 though, and like after takes, and like, I don't know, takes for example, Like already they just have a lot of compensation. They bring their pieces around. Opposite colored bishops as well, which gives them like counterplay against like sort of weak white king. Whereas if you compare this to, let's say, like knight c3, d takes c4, 95, knight c6 here, this is actually, like, if you look, it scores much better, like 65% after the main move queen e8. Definitely much different to this position where like black scores 53%, right? So sorry, white rather. But yeah, again, like in this position, what's a difference? So it's basically that we haven't yet castled short, which means that, say, like if they did play e5, this actually wouldn't really be that good because we can just take, go queen takes c4, and we have the luxury actually to, like, you know, go bishop f4 and maybe just castle long. Sometimes we also play f3, put our king on f2, which means that like they're probably better off not going e5. c5 is a very common move. It's most popular in the database, but still white scores very well. Engine evaluation not super like convinced necessarily, but if you look at all the games in the database and just get a feel of what is going on, you know, basically material is equal, but there's opposite colored bishops. Opposite colored bishops usually means side who's attacking does very well. And basically, like after f3, the gist is that like very often after some sort of like 95 thing, you get like this sort of exchange, like bishop d4, let's say. This bishop very often just overpowers this one in the long run. We're going to be advancing these kingside pawns forward, and it's not a very fun position for black to play. And again, I really want to emphasize this point because, like, I remember when I played this line with black, like bishop e7 castles a while ago, like when I was younger and I played like d takes c4. I don't think a single time I ever faced knights 3 in this position, but I faced castles a hell of a lot of times, which really is important because you might think like all these people, they have all these chessable courses and stuff they've went through, but you know, people are going to review the lines they've faced. If they never face a line, they might review it, but there's a good chance they'll forget all the details and stuff, which is good news for people like us who are a bit tricky. When we play, again, these sidelines and main lines, they might sort of know they exist, but very often they're still not really going to be able to act in sort of the best possible way. Okay, I just want to show one more example in this video. Like, I could even show more. Like, there's endless examples I could show, which is why we have to cut it off at some point, right? I mean, I'm enjoying this. If you are too, like, leave a like on the video or something, leave a comment. Maybe we can do a part 2 of this even, but yeah, this was another game I played from the Australian Championships. This was maybe the round 4, maybe round 5 game, can't quite remember. But basically my opponent, WGM, not quite in the prime anymore, but like still technically higher rated than me. And she went into a Grunfeld. I knew ahead of time this was going to happen. Like, there's a lot of different stuff you can do in the Grunfeld. Like, there's this sort of, like, okay, we're already in the, like, exchange variation, which is definitely, like, what you could call a main line. But, like, granted, in this position, there's other stuff you can do. You can play, like, knight f3, followed by bishop g5. You can play bishop g5 immediately. You can play, like, you know, like, Russian variation, queen b3 stuff. You can play, like, there's even this weird variation with h4, which, again, sideline of mainline. Like, sideline would be, for example, just sideline purely would be like Trompowsky. Okay, or like, this is not sideline of mainline. But d4, c4 is like mainline, and then like going for something here, like later down the line, like say I did in this position after c5. Bishop b5 definitely qualifies for sideline of mainline, I think, at least. And again, this is interesting where this is actually quite a trending line these days, but a lot of people who are like at my level, they don't really properly like study this, especially with my opponent. She's not super up to date with like modern theory, so it worked quite well for this game. And like bishop d7, bishop e2, you basically just say the bishop is kind of a bit misplaced here. Knight e7 happened in the game, but this is quite passive. You ideally want to put the knight in c6, but she probably, like, when you put the knight in c6, there's a lot of like tactical confrontational stuff can happen with d5, and if you haven't properly looked at the theory, it's kind of scary to potentially allow this. So she ended up going for knight e7, but already like this worked very well because, like, if you already look at the evaluation, quite a substantial plus. And to get any advantage against a Grunfeld, it's very difficult in general. It's one of the most solid openings, computer-proof openings, that can be played against d4. So very often the Grunfeld is actually like a prime example of an opening you might not want to go for, like with the absolute sharpest, most balls to the wall, like theoretical variation, because Grunfeld players are the types of guys who actually, or gals who actually study this stuff, right? And if you're like me, you probably don't want to be trying to play a memory contest, so you just throw the ball down another lane and ask them to play in your territory. And already you can see like knight c6 definitely clearly better than some of the other moves. And the whole idea is like, I should show this by the way, which is that after castles takes queen c2. This move in particular is quite important, where you can see like we score 60%. Without this position actually isn't anything too special, and maybe even still it's not anything too great, but the basic point is that we're willing to basically give black like a pawn up advantage in many of these positions, but they're going to be having to give up their precious starks with bishop in order to do so, where now they sort of have this weak king going on, and it's very difficult to actually lose this for white, even though you are down a pawn, just because the weak king, in my opinion at least, and from what other strong players believe about this position, seems to be sort of more important. But I mean, it's worth saying, like, am I gonna, like, after showing this stuff on YouTube and stuff as well, and like having played this game being in the database, like, am I gonna spam this bishop b5 line against Grunfeld? Probably not, right? But it's the sort of thing, like, if you're just an online player, like, you can get very good results just spamming this line. Or if you just play your club and none of the games go into the database, go ahead, spam this line, right? And people, you know, you're still going to be able to take them off guard, because, you know, like, unless they specifically know you played this sort of, you know, kind of sideline, they're probably not going to prepare for it, because, like, in the Grunfeld, there's, like, 20 different critical lines. They have, that might be a slight exaggeration, but there's a lot of different stuff. There's relatively sharp that they have to study for. Some random bishop b5 check, it's not really going to be at the top of their priority list. But again, when you play this, like, I want to emphasize, it's not like some complete shortcut. Like, even when my opponent played this knight d7 thing in the game, like, it's still an exchange Grunfeld structure. You need to understand the mechanics of how all this stuff kind of works together. And because I had played similar positions over the years, for example, like, I had played this more like mainline bishop e3 stuff before, which is decent, but I knew, like, okay, like, she probably has some vague idea of what to do against this. Whereas again, with bishop b5 check, I'm like, she probably has not looked at this recently at all. And while again, there are going to be some people who just say focus on like the structures or whatever, and while it's not necessarily bad advice, like, you could technically say after any of number of moves here, like bishop e3, rook b1, bishop e2, like, you're all getting kind of the same structure. But like, if you really know some like specific theory, it can really help you sort of navigate your way and trick your opponent into like a much better version of that structure. In this case, I was able to do that, where my opponent went knight e7, and then like in a few moves, I was able to get already quite a substantial advantage as we progressed through the game, compared to what, you know, if you just banged out like 16 moves of like mainline Grunfeld theory that your opponent's definitely seen before, like, I wouldn't have gotten this good of a position. Again, our openings, like, everything, that's not what I really want to say in this video, but, you know, if you're going to study openings, you may as well play to win, right? So that's what I'm trying to give you in this video, sort of my quote-unquote blueprint. People love using that word, but yeah, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed it. I don't want to babble on too much more, but, you know, if this has been useful, you know, definitely please leave a like, comment, subscribe, whatever. But yeah, don't want to take up too much more of your time. Thank you for watching.